All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll now be beginning our webinar today, transforming your API testing experience with the OpenAPI specification. Brief introduction here though, we're a Boston-based company, SmartBear, with 8 offices globally that focus on creating solutions for developer, testers, and operations teams to help instill quality throughout the entire development lifecycle. We were founded in 2009, and we continue to add new products to our portfolio and line of work, including we have our open source tools with Swagger and SoapUI, and our newest additions to the family with HipTest, which is an agile test management platform, and even tools like cross-browser testing, which is a device lab in the cloud that we've added. All right, here on our x-axis, we go from dev, test, to operations teams. And then we have our UI and API layer on the y-axis. So we have tools from the front end, test left, test complete. They're going to be your functional testing tools. And then the API side, SoapUI Pro, ServiceV Pro, LoadUI Pro. Those are our tools on the API side that we'll be talking about more today. Brief commercial interruption. We have news of our second annual SmartBear user conference. You can find more at the address listed, smartbear.com/connect-2018. You'll be able to purchase a ticket there. We have awesome speakers from customers from different industries that have been either testing or using our products for years. So we have a ton of experience there. It was an amazing experience last year with, again, great sessions, workshops, and talking and speakers. But we're also this year right downtown in the Copley Marriott. So we'll be central location for anyone in the Northeast, and we encourage you to stop by and grab a ticket. All right. So starting with OpenAPI, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the OAI spec and Swagger, but just in case anyone is new here to this, the OAS, as we'll talk about today, it's a standard language agnostic interface for RESTful APIs. It allows this kind of human and computer readable language for you to collaborate over the specification. It's not real source code, but it's kind of this extraction layer, this YAML file. And one of the greatest things about it is it's this common vocabulary that opens up a world of possibilities. So it's machine and human readable, it's language agnostic, and there's tons of powerful tooling built around it. And before a single line of actual real code is written, this is where the magic happens. It all happens on the spec itself. And there are some really neat tools, I think, for the UI side of the house, and more front-end developers are familiar with it. But they allow designers and developers to work together real closely. They're collaborating. There's tools that can export like neat prettified code based on just some drag and drop on the interface. Even Dreamweaver, right? It's like a decade old at this point. I mean, it's been doing this kind of collaboration between the code itself and the design and the mock. And that's because that presentation layer of the web has had standards for so long. So they're not always perfect, but like W3C, HTML, CSS, they have all these standards. Swagger for the API side is the standardization. There previously wasn't anything for RESTful to help you out with both the collaboration between development and design, and Swagger really brings that out for teams. It opens up a world of possibilities here across the entire life cycle. So from design and components and standardizations, mocking, implementing the code itself, testing and virtualizing maybe that code and running functional and load tests against it, documenting the API and allowing it to be easily consumed, and then deploying the API itself and actually into the wild and client-generated libraries. So all of this can be born from that OAS. Everything is derivative from that, and it allows us to kind of seamlessly work our way through this world with that standard kind of specification in the background. And with OAS, we have the Swagger tooling on top of it. So we have our Swagger editor, which helps us design APIs, editor.swagger.io. We have the UI with it that helps us kind of make legible and consumable documentation. We have Swagger CodeGen that will make those nice client libraries easy for you. And then on top of that, we've added a SwaggerHub, which is our collaborative platform to do everything together in the cloud, and then Swagger Inspector. So this is our test and auto generation or documenting tool. You'll be able to go to Swagger Inspector, put in your endpoint, get the results back, and even generate documentation from there. So it's a really quick verification. It's built right on the cloud. So it's cloud-based and free. It allows us, again, to test and validate quickly, and everything is worked via the OpenAPI spec. So everything is derivative from there. And again, it's just really easy to use. If you're a Swagger user, hop on over to Inspector, make your call, visualize the API. It allows you to kind of explore the API, look around it. It'll help you a little bit with modeling as well. And then bring that over to SwaggerHub and actually work on the API inside there. And it's just a great, again, quick way to start testing your API. But at this point, it's not automated. So all the things we're doing right now, testing, we're manual testing, and we're just verifying. The next part is test automation. And this is really the reasons why we need test automation in our life. Faster deployment cycles. So we're going to actually be able to deploy value to the market quicker. It becomes a part of our workflow and actually not a bottleneck does testing. We can actually keep up with our development. Also test coverage. It allows us to truly increase our test coverage. At the end of the day, there's always going to be a finite amount of time to test a product, and teams with mainly manual testing will just not be able to sufficiently test and have enough coverage across their application. Automation actually makes that possible. We'll go through some really cool data-driven scenarios through our demo, but by automating our testing, we're able to actually test more of our application without adding time to our testing scale. And lastly, faster time to resolution. We're going to get instant feedback in our development cycle. So you can spend all morning on a new feature, and then within 5 minutes of checking that code in, you're going to get all the results back from whether your new code either passes or if it fails. And it's not this 2-week period where you're going into a sprint and you're tossing it over the wall to your QA. Automating your testing and having that instant feedback, you can see that, okay, I worked on a feature, let's say on a Monday, and 2 weeks later, my QA comes back and says, hey, there was a bug in it. Well, I've been coding now for 2 weeks since then, and I've been working on other things. There's just like a switch of the mind that now I have to go back and retrace my steps, see what context I'm in. By automating it and having sufficient coverage at that instantaneous point of committing, you're able to not go on to something else. You'll get back, hey, code or lines 50 through 55 that I was just working on, there's a bug there. So go right there and fix it. And test automation is truly transformative when we look at moving from a traditional software testing to a more accelerated DevOps trend, or shifting that testing left. You can see here the average cost of a bug. It increases as we move throughout the SDLC. So maybe a waterfall software team might follow this, where they have their integration, their system, and their end-to-end testing happening well into the testing phase. So when a bug is caught there, it costs us a significant amount of dollars. According to the IBM study, it literally goes from $100 in development to that same bug will cost you $1,500 if it gets into the hands of an actual consumer. And that's not based on actually maybe the revenue that bug might bring you in production, but this is based on strictly the amount of work that goes through your entire software chain to actually fix a bug that is caught by either a monitoring tool or a late stage QA. Automating this allows us to move and shift this bug discovery drastically. We can help ourselves test faster and earlier in the development process. We can significantly reduce the cost of a defect this way. If a developer is able to check in code and we can get an error back, that again, it's not just a unit test we ran and every time we check in, we're actually running integration tests. We're running full end-to-end API tests. We're running even maybe load tests on our virtualized infrastructure, which we'll go through. But all of this helps us get more bugs at an earlier point in the development process. And API testing is great. We'll look here, kind of this pyramid that's super famous of UI, API, and unit testing. There are some awesome advantages to testing at this middle business layer. The first part is immediate testing of the business logic. We don't have to wait for multiple sprints to actually get the full application built out, to get the UI so we can actually test whether our data is correct. The API, because of the nature of it, can happen early in your sprint cycle. So the first day you built that, you can start testing business logic against it. It's also less brittle and easier to maintain than other tests. Traditional UI testing is expensive to maintain. It's expensive to keep up. I think UIs are constantly changing and everything. So doing your testing at the service layer, at the API layer, is hugely advantage to not spending every Monday and Tuesday on maintaining the test that broke from your weekend builds. There's just a lot of maintenance that goes along with UI testing, and API testing is a huge time saver there. Next is faster test execution. This is another piece. API tests are this awesome kind of matrix of perfect amount of coverage and actual insight, but also execute really quickly. UI tests, they might take 3, 5, 10 minutes maybe for a long one to actually run through the entire scenario. API tests, on the other hand, might take half a second to 5 seconds on a long chain. You're getting that immediate feedback without having to go through that 2-minute cycle. And then faster root cause analysis. With UI, with other types of testing, there's multiple points of failure. You can imagine a UI and end-to-end situation where you're logging into something. There's a million different reasons why a test might break on a run. With API testing, it's a much faster connection between what did I do, what broke, what do I need to fix. Some of the challenges of API testing that we'll actually kind of go through today and hopefully solve for you. First one is test data. This is always something big for QA. It's getting harder. We can't use live data sets. We can't use our production database. We need to make these kind of faux data sets to run through our testing. So test data is a huge challenge, especially for API testing, where at the end of the day, that's what APIs are doing, right? We're exchanging data, we're exchanging functions that are based on that data. Secondly, environments and availability. This is the same thing with UI. I think on the UI side, we have things like a cross-browser testing that will supplement your browsers. But for APIs, there's a lot of different things going on behind the scenes with service-oriented architecture and microservices where there's multiple APIs chained together. Availability really hurts us there. If we're not able to have the APIs accessible, be able to test them throughout our pipeline, that's going to hamper us and really create a bottleneck. The next is end-to-end workflows. Chaining together requests is pretty complicated. It's not something easily done with like a unit testing framework or even a pretty complex API framework driven by code. It is something that usually a solution will have to be used for those end-to-end test cases as APIs grow and they become more of just a normal part of business. That'll the kind of focus on that aspect of API testing will be heightened. So next, let's kind of look at what we can do there with all the challenges we talked about, all the advantages of API testing that we kind of want to do. Okay, now let's look at SmartBear's toolset and where we help out. We help out in the design, build, testing, integrating. All of that is kind of right where we fit as our DNA. And then we also help on the other side with monitoring. So once you're actually in production, we're able to help there. So on the design side, we have our Swagger and SwaggerHub tools with the build as well with CodeGen. Those two tools are helping us get to market faster. And then as we move into testing, that's really where you see kind of the bread and butter of SmartBear's DNA with tools like SoapUI Pro, LoadUI Pro for load testing, ServiceV Pro for virtualization. But this is all squarely where we fit in the tooling space and where we can really help out on the APIs, not just on the API side, but also on the UI side. The deploy and manage here, we have many partners. So we work with a lot of the gateways like Amazon, IBM, Azure. All of those we closely integrate with so we can actually get your API definition, get that API code deployed and built. And then like we were talking about with monitoring, AlertSite is a full-blown synthetic monitoring platform that can help out on the API level, on a web UI, or even a mobile UI. And one of the great things about AlertSite is it can actually be installed pre and post production. So you can take an AlertSite agent, put it into one of your nodes that may be a part of your CI pipeline, and you can actually monitor your application as it moves through the pipeline. And all of this gets to the point of Swagger and SmartBear tooling are closely linked at the hip. We're trying to do testing from the definition and kind of enhance that. So here you can see we have our Swagger we have our OAS definition getting consumed into ReadyAPI, which we'll talk about, SoapUI Pro. And that's where we'll make our test cases. You can easily make test cases by importing it, and we'll actually be able to run those test cases as well. So you have your spec being made by maybe a designer, developer, then transitioning over into SoapUI Pro with your quality team. Next, we can help virtualize a Swagger spec. So virtualization is something we'll talk about here. It's a little bit more than mocking, where we're actually able to dynamically edit and configure our Swagger spec, which is fantastic for teams that are trying to move quickly, development testing teams that are working at the same time. You'll be able to basically stand up a living, breathing API Swagger specification in just minutes with ServiceV Pro. And then again, if you want to run tests against it, you can run full-blown functional and load tests against that virtualized asset as if it was the real thing. And we want to do that, or Swagger and ServiceV really, it makes it simple to mirror production environments. We talked about shifting left, trying to test earlier in the process. We talked about microservices and kind of containers and all the different testing that's happening. We need all of those different environments to look as closely as we possibly can to that production environment to get great results. So here, this is where that virtualization aspect, if you can think of each component here as a different Swagger spec, this really starts to come to life. On the left here, as we're going through our development stage, let's say we're taking a month to build out these 3 different APIs. We're going to spend an entire month just building. We're not really doing any testing yet, besides unit testing maybe. And then we're going to get to the integration point. Okay, Scrum Master says we need to start putting these components together, and let's see how they work together. Well, one of the components, one of the Swagger specs might not be ready. One of them might be a third party, let's say, and we actually can't test against it. So we're still able to only test a couple of things in our week 1 of integration testing. Next is kind of, we're getting closer, right? Maybe the other spec gets done, it's finished, we're able to go. But we still have that third party specification, that API that we're actually not able to fold totally into the end-to-end testing. This is where you start to get that QA bottleneck. This is where all the bad things in testing that slow development processes down, this is where it all comes from, not having all these components, all these APIs together. Well, with ServiceV, you can virtualize all of this so that end-to-end testing with SoapUI Pro or any other tool you want, that load testing can be conducted in the first 2 to 4 weeks of development. You're going to have your APIs Swagger specification, and you're going to be able to stand it up right away and be able to get to all of this testing really, really early in the process, which you'll see. It's pretty amazing that you can take kind of that, what used to be fulfilled by mocking and a static response, you can now have multiple data sets kind of respond out of an endpoint. It's pretty cool. And then lastly, truly automating your pipeline with the Swagger spec and the SmartBear tooling. Here on the left, we have SwaggerHub. Let's say we edit our SwaggerHub actual documentation. We change something on the spec side. That's going to be hosted in GitHub. So Jenkins is actually going to be listening to our repo over and over for that change to be made. Once that change is enacted on by CI or by Jenkins, they're going to try to build it. So first, they're going to run some unit tests and package the application up. We're going to deploy just the API into a Docker container, and then we're going to run our API tests against it. We do this because we don't want to delay the full deployment. So if we actually built out the entire application, that would take a little bit longer right here in this stage, and then we'd be wasting our time. Because if these API tests fail right now, they're just going to go right back into our reporting mechanism, right back to the developers, and they're going to start fixing it. We're not going to actually run our UI tests if the API tests fail. This is also just a great kind of best practice for breaking up your pipeline. Try to test the things that actually don't take a long time to build. And the API is certainly one of those. You should be able to stand that up quickly. But SoapUI Pro, LoadUI Pro, ServiceV, all the tools we'll be looking at today They integrate really directly into any of your CI tools you're using, say TFS, Jenkins, TeamCity, all going to be able to work really seamlessly with those tools. And then on the far side here, once we're actually in production, and let's say all of those tests did pass, we're now able to monitor that with AlertSite. So after our deployment and our release management is all clear, we'll go into production and get this value into the customer's hands, and we'll start monitoring it. Let's say we fail an SLA 10 minutes after, something starts to degrade in our infrastructure. That AlertSite can actually make a REST call back to Jenkins, in this case, back to their rollback API, and we can deploy the previous version's API that we knew was working. So this is a great little kind of snapshot of all the SmartBear and Swagger tooling that can be deployed inside your CI pipeline. And with that, that is all the slides we have for today. I tried to get through that as quickly as possible so we can leave the most amount of time to actually fire up some of the ReadyAPI tool sets, some of the SwaggerHub, and let's see really how we can test the Swagger spec. And to do that, today I have one of our SEs, Stephen Colon. He helps us out on both the Swagger side and the ReadyAPI side. So is all things API in the SmartBear family.
All right, thank you, Dan. Yeah, so let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen here and actually start looking at some of these tools that we provide here at SmartBear and how they really help us fulfill what we just saw in these slides. Relieving a lot of these challenges with APIs, automating things a lot quicker. So in this demonstration, we're going to see quite a few different tools, but all with the overarching idea of getting your Swagger specification and testing it early by using virtualization through ServiceV and functional testing through SoapUI Pro. So we're going to see quite a few products. If there's any questions, feel free to pop it into the Q&A box and we'll take a look at it at the end of this session. We'll save some time for questions. And the first thing we're going to look at is Swagger Inspector. Now, this is one of our newer tools, and it's a free cloud-based tool that lets you make API calls from the browser. So what we can see here is actually I have an existing definition. So what I can do, since I have an existing Swagger definition, is go ahead and look at what my definition has to offer. I can parse through it. I can go ahead, select different API calls, and one API call we're going to focus on in here in our pet store application is this get pet by ID method. And I can go in, make any calls that I need to. So let's try out a few different ones here. We can see I get my response here in the bottom. And this all works really well for when you don't really know much about your API, or if you have no documentation at all, you can just import your URL directly into this space. And this history will be populated where you can see each API call, how they were responded to. And you can even then select one or multiple of them to then create Swagger definitions from it. So there's quite a few things going on with this, but the overarching point is that if you don't have any Swagger specifications existing for any APIs, you can go ahead and use Inspector to generate those very quickly so that then you can collaborate on them using SwaggerHub, using many of our integrations in SwaggerHub, which we'll talk about in a moment, to then start actually implementing it and then bring it into all of the testing and virtualization spaces. So that's Swagger Inspector, and that's available at inspector.swagger.io. So you can go ahead and feel free to check it out and see what you can get from that. So now we're in SwaggerHub, and we're here on our pet store application Swagger specification. It's just a completed specification here. And let's talk about a little bit about SwaggerHub and what it has to offer. So SwaggerHub is a tool built on top of the Swagger open source tooling that will allow us to collaborate on the design of these RESTful Swagger specifications. And it also allows me to scale my API design efforts to a more enterprise level where I have, not just one API design, maybe I have 10, 15, 20, however many I need for my company. In SwaggerHub, we have things like setting up different organizations so that you can have APIs wrapped in under an organization. You can batch users under a team. So you can actually make a team of architects, a team of developers, a team of designers, and have very fine control over who sees what API and what sort of permission do they have with it. So you can set them to just view the API, they're just a consumer, or they can be a designer where they can go in and edit, make any comments and changes so that they are influencing the development of the design of the API more heavily. So what we're looking at here is our editor available in SwaggerHub. In the middle, we have our API editor. That's where we actually write out our Swagger specification. We offer a couple of different things to ease sort of writing longer specifications like auto completion, so that if you're not familiar with the specification, you can go ahead, use this auto completion to see what objects are available, what fields you can enter and things like that. On the left, we have our directory, which is where, as I'm writing along specification, as you can see, there's quite a few operations in this pet store. I can go ahead and easily just click where I want my editor to go. So as a consumer or as a designer who's coming into this API for the first time, I can go ahead and easily just click around and see the different operations and what's written under them. Then on the very left, we have, on the very right, we have our UI. And this is where the documentation and consumers coming in to efficiently understand what this API is doing can do that. So we can see here we have our information. Let me go ahead and just maximize this a little bit. We have our different operations. I can go ahead, let's go to this pet ID. I can go ahead, open up the actual specification, look at what responses are available for that API call. And then in SwaggerHub, we have a try it out functionality. So something SwaggerHub can do as you're designing your API is stand up a very simple auto mocking server under your API specification so that if you don't have anything implemented yet, you can make very basic calls, get very basic responses back. There isn't much API logic within it though. So it's just a really good first look at your API. I can go ahead, make a API call, see what my auto mocking service gives back. It gives me my 200 with this example information. And as a consumer, it just makes it very easy for me to understand what to expect back without having the service fully implemented. What we're going to see is that some of the more complex logic that we want within sort of a mock version of this API can be virtualized in ServiceV. So we'll see how easily in ServiceV we're going to just import the Swagger specification and start virtualizing it without any scripting. It's all going to be within the UI. We're going to create a very a more robust virtual service that'll represent this pet store application before it's even implemented. So in SwaggerHub, once you have your API specification written, we also offer a couple of other things for anyone who's not aware, things like our code generation options. So as you go into your design is finished and you go into a more implementation phase, you can generate code in either client or server SDKs, things like Node.js, Python Flask, PHP, and et cetera, so that you can then give this to your developers, or your developers can come in and generate this so that they can start from a skeleton based on the specification and just implement the operations for each one that we're using in our pet store. We also have API SwaggerHub integrations that include integrations to several different kinds of gateways. So we have things like Amazon API Gateway, where every time you save your specification, it can push it into an API gateway and then specifically for Amazon, a developer can come in and start implementing Lambda sync functions against those operations that were imported. So we'll keep sort of the sync between now when we're done with our design, we can begin implementation as quick as possible so that our developers sort of go up and running. And then we also have integrations with a lot of different Git repositories. And this is where, if you remember the automated pipeline slide, where you get that usage of SwaggerHub with the Swagger specification feeding into a pipeline like Jenkins. That'll be done through this, something like GitHub.
And then it's great here just to point out that SwaggerHub integrates with GitHub, and then Jenkins can just listen to GitHub. So it's actually not that SwaggerHub is going to Jenkins. It's just we're all using GitHub for kind of that middle repo part.
Exactly.
Or anything, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever, as long as it's Git.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that's how you can also just connect to any CI/CD system. We're using Jenkins as like one of the more popular examples, but it's really, we're just connecting the pieces for you. You can then use it as much as you need. And then we also have a style validator where you can implement different validations on having examples for models and different guidelines that'll be enforced, so that as a team of designers come in, they can go ahead and make any changes, but make sure it sort of is coherent with the overall style for the company. So that's a little bit about SwaggerHub and how you can use it to then go into the deployment space very easily through the code gen and the integrations. But one of the challenges that Dan spoke to was waiting for development to finish to then start testing. And what do we, as QA testers, people who sort of have to wait for that, what do we do then? And that's where ServiceV and ReadyAPI really comes into play, so that I can start building a testing framework against a virtual asset before development is even finished. And so when development is finished, we'll really speed up that time to market, because I can just start testing immediately. So from SwaggerHub, let's go ahead and move over into ReadyAPI. And for anyone not familiar, ReadyAPI is actually a platform that houses several different products. Things like where we'll be focusing on today is ServiceV for virtualizing any assets that are causing bottlenecks. So for us in this example will be the Swagger specification that is for an API that isn't implemented yet. We also have SoapUI Pro, which is our end-to-end functional testing product for APIs. And we're gonna sort of show how we can now, after we virtualize, then test the API and perform, data-driven testing, contract testing with the Swagger specification, and even automation, all with SoapUI Pro. And then some of the products we're not gonna cover is Secure Pro, which is our security testing product. This is where you can take any API calls, and build out security scans against them to test for things like SQL injections, fuzzing scans, et cetera, and to really get a good look at whether your API reveals any sensitive information. And then lastly, we have LoadUI Pro, which is our performance testing product, where you can very easily create complex load testing from a UI without using any scripting. You can distribute your load tests very easily so that you can test load, to the magnitude of 100 concurrent users, or sorry, 1,000 concurrent users or larger. So those are some of the products within the platform. And what we're gonna do today to just begin this virtualization process is use the SwaggerHub plugin to go ahead and read what's going on in SwaggerHub very easily without having to download a specification and upload it and try to do all these different moving parts. We connected the two just to make it a lot easier. So I'm just gonna search within my organization. I'll see that whether it's public or private, I can still see it because it's through my credentials. And I can select my pet store to then quickly bring in my Swagger specification into a ReadyAPI project. So now I have each operation here within that specification brought into my ReadyAPI project. And the step to virtualize it is very easy. I can just go ahead, create and generate a new virtual service. I'll just leave all of these different ones selected. And what ServiceV is going to do is create this local virtual service on port 8088. So with that, we're going to see that now I can do the bulk of virtualizing this API, but we're getting started not from scratch, but from a drawn out virtual service that has all of the operations available. We have all of the responses here. So these are all the different response types. And then I can start implementing some of the more nuanced logic of the API from here, but it's a lot much quicker of a process. So I don't have to wait for my development. I can just start building this out and then go into my testing very easily. So let's go ahead and actually look at one of these calls. So let's go and find the pet ID. So this is sort of the one we're focusing on. It's getting the pet by pet ID. I can see that in these responses, ServiceV read the example responses that were available. So I have something to just work with as I implement it. I can sort of see I have it in JSON, XML. I'm going to go ahead and just delete these XML values for now, just sort of limiting the scope to just JSON at the moment. And so we have something to start with. It works, really well just importing it. We really try to couple these products together to make that process easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and relabel some of these. So I'm going to call this sort of my 200 OK response. This is the 404. And then there we go. So I'm just doing a little sort of house cleaning here. And then what I need to do to then complete sort of a very basic virtualization of this endpoint that I can then go in and expand once I build my testing framework is this dispatch style. And this is where ServiceV tells any incoming requests which response to give it. So this is where I can build out the more complex logic all within the UI without having to script. So currently I can do things just like sequential or random, where irrelevant of the request, I'll just spit back something from my response in this pattern. Or I can do something like query matching, XPath, or parameter dispatch style, where I look at the request, I look for a specific piece of it, like a path parameter or a query parameter, and I'll return a specific response. So it'll build out some more of this routing so that as an end user, as the tester, I'll go ahead and build out my framework, but it'll be a realistic looking API. So I can just go ahead, create this parameter rule where I'll check if the pet ID is equal to 0, and then I'll return something. Just as a small example, if the API is just to show how easy the UI is to build out these rules, and I can just kind of keep on compounding this logic. So now with that, with this virtual API, it's on localhost 8088, and I can go ahead and run this and start building out a functional test against it. So I'm going to go back to the projects tab. I'm going to take the pet ID request. Oops. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this into SoapUI Pro so that I can start building out an end-to-end testing workflow against it very quickly. So I have my workflow. I'll make sure it's pointing to my virtualized service. And now I can do things like running the request. I see I have that response from my virtual service. And then I can create assertions against it. So, I'm just going to create a very basic assertion to make sure that it is a 200 status code assertion. So I always get this 200 OK response. Then on top of this assertion, we can actually start contract testing very easily with the Swagger specification, where I'm going to take the URL to my Swagger specification and use it within our Swagger compliance assertion. And this is where now each time that I run this request, especially as I'm data driving and adding multiple values, I'll go ahead and check the response against the Swagger specification so that if there's any issues, if there's any issues with compliance, I'll get a very clear message. So this is how we further support Swagger. Now, once I have this call, I'm going to go ahead and start data driving this with SoapUI Pro's data-driven capabilities. The first step to that is just adding a data source into our our test case. And in this data source, I can pull data from many different sources, things like a database or Excel file, or iterating through JSON or XML. What I'll do today is just use a data generator where it's going to go ahead and generate random integers for me, just so that I can create a great randomized workflow that'll just check numbers randomly, and I'm always rest assured it's compliant and it's always giving me a proper status code when it's returned. So with that, we have our sort of randomized data that I can just then throw in. So we'll just use 10 different rows. This will be the basis of my testing where I'm, randomly covering different numbers, seeing how my API responds. If anything fails, I'll be able to see that very easily. With the point and click testing, I'll go ahead and bring that data source property, which has those numbers, into the API call. This is also how we can chain test steps together very easily by just passing properties along very quickly. And lastly, I'll go ahead and just add a loop. And this is where we're gonna loop over the data source, all those different rows of data, and run the request each time. So with that, without waiting for development, development probably barely got into generating the code from SwaggerHub. I have my data-driven testing ready where I can run this and see what happens. Now, because I didn't implement every ID, we're gonna see a couple of different things, and we can see that for every data-driven iteration, we have our pass condition. So everything's working really well. And we have this workflow already created before development even occurred. So now that we have this testing available within SoapUI Pro, one of the key goals we see people always coming in after doing this is then automation. We want to now get this without someone having to click play, without having to manually come in and always configure this. So SoapUI Pro contains a command line tool called Test Runner that'll let you take this data-driven workflow that will have, all this different information, all these different tests, and bring it into any CI/CD system that is available. Something like Jenkins, which we actually have a native plugin for, or like Bamboo or TeamCity. And in this launch test runner UI, we can go ahead and look at the command line, the different arguments that are available, some of the functionality we didn't talk about, like generating reports, using different environments, selecting the test case or test suite that's running. And then we can get this command line that sort of parses that out into the actual command line arguments for us to then copy into a CI/CD system like Jenkins, so that when we think about an automated pipeline, we have SwaggerHub connecting to Git that then Jenkins listens to. We can then embed this testing phase into that automated pipeline. So as it's listening, as it gets kicked off, it'll then at some point kick off these tests using the virtualized service. And then at some point, once the service is fully developed, it can then switch over easily and use the real service. So this is how we can really speed up the time to then testing and overall the time to market. So with that, that's sort of how Swagger and this SwaggerHub really feed into ReadyAPI to then virtualize and test these things a lot quicker. So now with these sort of last 13 minutes, let's go ahead and look at a couple of questions and see what you guys are thinking about this. We went through a lot of information. We covered quite a few different products. So if you're confused on any of this, we have tons of resources where you can learn more. Maybe you want to learn more just about ServiceV. We have, webinars pointed to just single products and things like that, where you can learn a lot more.
All right, so some questions. One of them, quick one to answer is, do you offer any training seminars once we purchase ReadyAPI? So we do. We have a full academy. It's a free academy for customers that we run 101, 201, and 301 style, like classroom exercises on a weekly basis. So you can come learn more about the product and use cases. One of them is about virtualization. Didn't quite understand the purpose of creating virtualization. Can we go back to ServiceV Pro and just show, I think the real thing with ServiceV Pro is making multiple responses. So like you have a 200 ROM doggy. Can you change doggy to something else? Like, yep.
Absolutely.
Change the name, and then
you can change the name.
You get a multiple ones here. So we have doggy, we might have a cat. So all of this is made without the dev team. So the dev team is going off and building the thing that actually is going to say, when I say query 1, give me dog. When I say query 2, give me cat. That's all being built in code, and that's happening in a separate room. Here, we would have had to wait for that to happen. So we would have had to wait for 2 weeks for them to figure out how to make it say dog when we say 1, how to say cat when we say 2. That all is happening separate from the testing. But you can make that happen with ServiceV here and then start writing your test cases. So we saw the SoapUI hitting against this. You can imagine after a 2-week period, you'd have a pretty robust SoapUI Pro test suite built out against this virtualized asset. Yeah. Then when the dev team is done with actually building out the real code, you'll now have a full test suite already built for it, and you can deploy right to production. So there's no more, okay, development's going to be the first sprint, and then we have to throw it over to QA for the second half of the sprint. They're all happening at the same exact point. All right, does AWS API Gateway support OAS 3.0 yet?
Last time I checked, they didn't, but to be honest, that was like a month ago.
Okay, so, I know. OAS 3.0 is definitely the support. We support it fully at SmartBear with all of our tooling. We were one of the first, though. It's definitely a little bit lag behind as far as deployment. So most of them still on 2.0, yeah. But more and more moving to 3.0. How do you define the metadata type? I think that is on the spec itself.
So on the spec itself. So yeah, on the Swagger spec itself, you can define a bunch of different things. Looking at things like what it can consume, what it produces, sort of what each parameter it takes. So you can define a lot of these different data types. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking about, but within, if you go to swagger.io, you can read the documentation on how to define different types of data so that you can write your specification to match your API exactly.
All right. So enterprise model, thousands of internal APIs. They don't do design first. We expose some of the routes for third-party use. What do you advise to test the API spec? Right now, it's all maintained in a massive Postman collection, and the spec is generated from the code itself. Okay, so yeah, this is like a perfect example where it's okay to do code first and have your APIs out there. One of the things here is just importing all of that into ReadyAPI to automate it. So your collections, all of that can go into SoapUI Pro. You're going to be able to automate all of those, easily throw it up in Jenkins and get through it. Or again, use SoapUI Pro a little bit more manually. We have some awesome debugging things. So there's like step-by-step test debugging. So it's going to go through your chain call one by one, so you can actually watch the entire interaction happen and kind of see where you went wrong. But so you can do the same thing you're doing right now, keep it in your collection if that's working out for you, and then you can bring it into ReadyAPI. Or if you want to, like SwaggerHub is built for this, right? SwaggerHub is this place where we can collaborate. You can add users that maybe are in third party, and they can use your spec and you can work over it. So I definitely also can check out SwaggerHub for you.
Yep. And for SwaggerHub, you can import those specifications you're getting from code. You can just import that into SwaggerHub, either through the UI, or we have a registry API that sits in the back end. And yeah, like Dan was saying, just use our team organization functionality to control who's seeing it, who's a consumer, and really leverage a lot of these tools. So you don't need to rip and replace, but you can supplement and have some of this tooling to make it a lot easier for you.
And actually, this looks like probably one of the last questions I see, but can you download the Swagger definition from Inspector if you don't have a paid SwaggerHub account?
So you cannot?
You cannot. You need a free, you at least need a free account.
Yes,
So there
exactly.
is a limited free account, freemium product that will house a certain number of individual Swagger specs. So you could theoretically have your free account, download the definition, and then save it to an IDE or a Git repo for sure.
Yeah.
That's a way you could get around that a little bit. Is there a integration with TFS, VSTS with no Git? Yes, we're still able to run everything in ReadyAPI in TFS and VSTS. You don't need the Git connection there. You're still able to run all of your tests.
Yeah. The Git connection is more the convenience of collaboration and leveraging something that's already been existing for a while so that you can collaborate with your team. But yeah, you can build on the command line without any of that.
Is to use ServiceV Pro, do I need ReadyAPI license? Yes and no. So ReadyAPI is the platform itself, but it doesn't come with all of these. So each section above is a module. So SoapUI Pro, LoadUI Pro, and ServiceV Pro are individual licenses built into this ReadyAPI platform. So you'll pay for all of them separately. You won't be paying for other things that you might not need if you're just looking for ServiceV Pro. And then kind of follow up on that, is ReadyAPI similar to WireMock? So ServiceV Pro is definitely similar to WireMock, except for I would say it's mocking on steroids, right? And virtualization is definitely taking it to the next level. You're simply importing a spec, and even here with the doggy and the cat, that can all be in a CSV or that could be in a database, and you can drive all of that data through. So you can think about the time you spend mocking and building out a stub. You can build one of those mocked endpoints and then have thousands of different responses by just simply integrating a data set.
Yeah. And that's sort of, I get where you're like, oh, it's like WireMock, but it's sort of a 5-minute intro demonstration. I really recommend if you're looking into virtualization, looking into it more seriously, have a sort of really in-depth look at what ServiceV can offer, because you'll be surprised by a lot of these things like data-driving responses and making them a lot more dynamic.
Yeah, another thing just everyone loves is like the network stuff too.
Yeah.
So that call right there against the dog, we can actually change the network settings. So we can have latency. We can also talk about server capacity.
Yeah.
But there's huge kind of performance things we can also mimic that API with ServiceV Pro.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's going to wrap us up for today. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it coming out. Thanks for the questions, and especially thanks for Steven for our demo. We do have actually one poll that I'm going to shoot out right now to start. Launch poll. Would you like to see a customized demo of any of these tools that we discussed today? We can help you out with that getting started. So answer that, and everyone enjoy the rest of your August day.